This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. I'm very excited to have Toya with me today. How are you doing, Toya?
I'm good, Yaara. Glad to be back. We have taken a few weeks off, but I think this is a great episode to bring us back into the fall.
For sure. And, I think summer is always such a busy time for us. And I think an International Socialist Alternative, we've had so many things going on in the last month or so. So it's really cool to be back here, back in schedule, and especially with kind of like starting with a bang with this episode, which is kind of like a very current episode where, as people probably know, the 28th of September is the International Day for Safe Abortion. So this episode is going to be all around reproductive rights and abortion rights. And we have really exciting speakers today. But generally, I think this year, more than any year before, maybe, is kind of like one of the ones that we have to be talking about abortion. And I mean, Toya, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts about that in particular.
I mean, yeah, years back when we would talk about, the movements around abortion and the excitement around the fight back, we would talk about places like Poland, like Ireland. We would talk about Latin America a lot. In Argentina, there was a big movement there. Chile, Mexico more recently. But now we're talking about it here in the U.S., with the ramping up of attacks. It feels like every week there's new legislation being put forward, to limit people's access to reproductive health care, most notably with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, of course. And although in Socialist Alternative, we've been talking about this for a very long time and calling on the Democrats for a very long time to mobilize, millions of people were shocked and horrified and very scared, that this right was being taken away. And I think
understandably, it was 150 years ago, and it was one, through a struggle. People do not think that these rights can be taken back, but that's why it's so important that when we talk about it and mention, like the capitalist class doesn't want to give us these rights. We have to fight for them. But also when they can, they will take them back.
Right. And I mean, it's not just the U.S. There's, 16 countries across the world where it's 100%, prohibited. And 40% of women of reproductive age live in places where it's, illegal or limited. So, overwhelming majority of people have some sort of limits in access. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa is a really good example of how stark it can be. 92% of the people in that region of reproductive age live in countries with restrictive abortion laws. It's crazy.
I wanted to say exactly about that like the countries where it's completely prohibited or has a lot of kind of boundaries or kind of restrictions and barriers for women to get abortions and people who can get pregnant to get abortions. All the countries, most of the time, they will be even more difficult to get out of and get to a country that can offer this service. And then even the countries where we do have abortion rights, in a lot of places, it's too expensive for people to actually go and get it done. Not to mention in countries where you need health insurance that's going to be even more expensive, but even in countries that you don't necessarily need, as robust a health insurance, it's still going to be, in most cases, a really expensive procedure to have. So when we talk about abortion, we don't just talk about, the right to have abortion, but also the option to have it genuinely, like on demand, for free, for anyone who wants or needs it.
Right. I mean, especially, it's not just about wanting it. It's about needing it. It's about access. It's about choice. It's about economics. It just encompasses so many different things, having access to reproductive health care. But we have seen inspiring victories, Yaara. It's not all like doom and gloom over the past period. I mean, last year alone, we saw Mexico in certain states in Mexico giving more access. Argentina, Colombia, they've won important advances. And when the right wing does go on the offensive, what that means is a fight back, a response from working people to protect the access. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah, and we've seen the same in the US. There's been so many people out on the streets protesting it. And obviously it's something that we've heard all about constantly in the news since it's happened, before it happened, even like when it was just talks about it happening. And then, there's been places like Guatemala where kind of attempts to change the legislation actually were blocked by the mass movement that developed. So it's obviously a kind of like a place of contention, like between the right and working people trying to kind of fight for the rights. And it's really important that we have these episodes and that we talk about it and obviously get involved on the streets as well, to fight for our rights and to fight for abortion and reproductive rights. So I'm really happy to have this episode now. I think it's really timely with everything that's happening, and obviously with the International Day for Safe Abortion. And we have really cool people here, really cool guests here. So first of all, we've got Anne, who's an executive committee member of the International Socialist Alternative in Germany. So how are you doing, Anne?
Great. How are you doing, Yaara? Nice to see you again. Just have seen you in Berlin before.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you've been up to in the last couple of weeks, but I already know what you've been up to.
I already know. Yes.
Maybe you should tell everyone, though.
We had the demonstration against the so-called pro-lifers there, who are who are a group of very different organizations, right-wing organizations. I will talk about this a little bit later. And it was the first time that we really had a international Rosa intervention there, to really shout against them and demonstrate against them, and also demonstrate for abortion rights in Germany, because also there it's not legal yet.
Thank you so much, Anne. And also we've got Kshama from the Socialist Alternative in the US, and she's also a council member in Seattle. And I'm sure everyone knows her. How are you doing, Kshama?
I'm doing good. How are you all doing?
I'm great. So what have you been up to in the last couple of weeks?
Well, in Seattle, we have played a solidarity role for the public school educators who were recently on strike. And today, some of the community organizers from our council office are actually on the picket line with the railroad workers, the freight industry workers who are being barbarically exploited, almost in almost Dickensian, the kind of working conditions that they're facing. And so they're courageously doing a national coordinated day of pickets today. And so it's really important that anybody who's watching this from the United States, please go to our council office website or Socialist Alternative website to see our solidarity statement and as to why the rail worker struggle is so important for all working people.
Thank you so much, Kshama. And yeah, we'll link it down below as well, and go and share that far and wide. And then our last speaker today is going to be Ruth from the Socialist Party in Ireland, which is the International Socialist Alternative in Ireland, who is also a former member of Parliament in Ireland. How are you doing, Ruth?
I'm fine, thanks.
What have you been up to in the last couple of weeks?
Well, the huge issue in Ireland right now, as around the world, is the cost of living crisis. And I've been organising with local residents here in West Dublin, building up a network to challenge the government to deliver policies that will benefit working class people in terms of dealing with the crisis, energy bills and food freezing prices, not people, basically. And we had a protest on Saturday locally, and there's a national demonstration this Saturday as well. So it's starting to become an issue as winter looms and as heating bills loom for people. They've been rising relentlessly.
Thanks, Ruth. It seems like the energy crisis is going to be something that a lot of people across the world are going to be having to deal with this winter. But I want to get right into it, and I want to start with Kshama, to try to begin to understand what's at the root of the current situation. I mean, we mentioned earlier in the US, we saw Roe v. Wade get taken away, which meant that it was up to each individual state whether or not they would want to allow abortion. And this was one of the main talking points from the Republicans, it should be up to the states. But now we see Republican Senator, is he a senator or is he a rep? I can't remember, but he's a Republican in Congress. Lindsey Graham put forward legislation to make a 15-week ban federally. And so we're seeing, even after this huge setback of a 50-year precedent, more attacks are still coming down the line. So I was wondering, Kshama, if you can talk a little bit about why we're seeing these attacks in the US, but not just the US, across the world today.
That's a really important thing for us to understand. I mean, if we are to fight back and defeat these attacks, then it is important for us to have a serious analysis about why these attacks are happening in the first place. And you mentioned the repeal of Roe v. Wade, which is a historic defeat for women, working people, and the LGBTQ community in the United States nationally, but it's also of a large scale that is relevant internationally. And you mentioned Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a right-wing Republican, his proposal to further bring attacks against abortion rights. And it's possible that this sort of attack will be maybe an overreach and will backfire on the right-wing Republicans. That remains to be seen. Nonetheless, we do have to make an effort to understand why these attacks are happening, and also broadly why there has been a significant growth in right-wing ideas on the whole. And I should say, it would be tempting to think that society and working people are turning irredeemably rightward. And certainly the echo for such right-wing ideas as, the kinds that you've just mentioned is growing. But the reality is quite different in the sense that, for example, in the United States, a national poll from January this year showed that 72% of Americans opposed overturning Roe v. Wade, as you mentioned, the 1973 Supreme Court ruling that federally guaranteed the legal right to abortion, and only 28% in that poll said they wanted it overturned. And in contrast, actually, the support for the Supreme Court, which is now overwhelmingly a right-wing Supreme Court, has fallen dramatically in the last 2 years by 15 percentage points. So the real explanation for why, for example, in the United States, Roe v. Wade was overturned and why attacks on abortion rights have happened in other countries is that the opening for the far right has expanded over the last decade because of the systematic failures of and betrayals by liberal parties and organizations of the political establishment, such as the Democratic Party in the United States. In the United States, the writing had been on the wall for many months, over the last year, especially after the language was leaked of the Dobbs ruling. The Dobbs ruling is what overturned Roe v. Wade, and it was clear that it would likely be a catastrophe for abortion access. The refusal by the Supreme Court to oppose the Texas abortion ban that happened actually last September, September last year, was already a huge blow to reproductive rights. And it was another event that portended a historic attack later that happened this year from the Supreme Court. But what happened? The Democratic Party, the major women's rights organizations such as NOW, NARAL, Pro-Choice, and Planned Parenthood, who are all tied to the Democratic Party, they should have been organizing mass actions over the last year, mobilizing support for the support that exists for abortion rights into active movements on the streets and in the workplaces, through school and university walkouts. But they did none of that. They did nothing to fight the Texas ruling last year, and they have categorically refused to put up any kind of fight despite the majorities that they may have had in the past in the House, in the Senate, and they also have the president. The White House is a Democrat, is from the Democratic Party. The complicity of the Democratic Party in this crisis is perhaps most stunningly illustrated by the fact that just days before this attack, Nancy Pelosi, who is a prominent Democrat and is the Speaker of the House, sent out robocalls to voters in Texas asking them to vote for Representative Henry Cuellar. He is a right-wing Democrat who opposes abortion and has had the support of the NRA, which is the gun-toting organization that is hated by young people and a majority of working people. This whole thing is scandalous. And on top of that, the Democrats have had 50 years to guarantee abortion rights. Joe Biden ran for president in 2020, promising to codify Roe v. Wade into law. Barack Obama did the same in 2007, and both times they failed to use their majorities in Congress to get it done. And In the meanwhile, the Republicans and the right wing have spent 50 years organizing and building for this all-out assault on women and queer people. And, and what have the Democrats done in those 50 years? Made empty promises that they have refused to keep. And in fact, it's a tragic list of broken promises, not only the failure to protect and codify abortion rights, but also Medicare for all, $15 an hour minimum wage, a Green New Deal, and so much more. And so, the important point to note here is that it's not like there hasn't been anger. There's huge anger in American society. And it was clear that people were willing to fight after the Roe v. Wade ruling was repealed. But what's happened is that the Democrats and their organizations have essentially sabotaged the development of a mass movement to defend abortion rights, leaving millions of ordinary people who are willing to fight bereft of any principled leadership. I mean, in contrast, Socialist Alternative organized rallies, marches, walkouts. Members of our New York City organization courageously occupied the office of Democrat Senator Chuck Schumer. And by the way, instead of meeting with the activists, his office sent the police on them. And I should also mention in closing that the biggest organization, unfortunately, the Democratic Socialists of America, they also failed to provide a lead, as did the majority of the labor leadership. And all of this shows that we need a massive shift away from a politics that is tied to the Democratic Party, the establishment parties, towards independent organizing and political organizations for the working class.
Thanks so much, Kshama. It's really important that we, call out who is actually to blame in the fact that, we had 50 years to really make abortion access law. And it was the inaction of the Democratic Party that led us to this situation. But I want to step outside of the U.S. for a minute. Anne had mentioned a rally that she had been at, that it seems like, Yaara, you were there too. This rally that was deemed as a pro-life rally. And I hate that term. I learned from watching the struggle to repeal the Eighth Amendment in Ireland, the term anti-choice. And I love it because that is what it is. It's not pro-life, it's anti-choice. So this, pro-life rally demonstration that took place in Berlin last week. And Yaara, what was going on there?
Yeah, so it was a big march. It's an annual march that happens in Berlin that I'm sure Anne can explain a bit more about, because I've only heard of it before going to intervene in the counter demonstration. But yeah, we organized, we intervened into the counter demonstration, which was really incredible. It was really good to see so many, young people out in the streets fighting and, kind of going against this March for Life, which, like, as you said, it's ridiculous. And it's always so infuriating to hear people say pro-life, because there may be, like you said, it's definitely like anti-choice, because they're not pro-life. They don't care if people die. Like these same people like oppose the state support for baby formula in the US, right? Like the same people are opposed to any immigration policy that will, stop babies and children from drowning when they're trying to escape war-ridden countries. Like, and at the same time, there also, you have in places like China, for example, you have forced sterilizations of populations that the government decides that they don't want. So saying that these people who are opposed to abortion are pro-life is a complete joke.
It is. Infuriating is the word. So I do want to go to you, Anne, to talk a little bit about this, because, oftentimes we talk about the working class coming together and pushing forward something, but this is more of a, an anti-choice demonstration. So can you explain, what sort of political forces would organize this type of rally, but also talk about what type of response we saw from just regular working people?
Yeah, thanks very much also for the invitation today. So maybe just to explain the situation briefly in Germany, because I think many people out there don't understand that and think that Germany is such a progressive country and we have everything, but technically we don't have the right on abortion. So just to explain that, it's still prohibited, it's just not prosecuted. But in fact, what it means is that pro-choice medical students do not get, for instance, study material in German. And as a consequence of this paragraph 218, which is still, I think it's nearly 150 years old, but it's still there. And as a consequence of cuts in the health sector and lack of training of new doctors from 2004 until today, the number of clinics and doctors who can do termination of pregnancy has nearly halved. And from more than 2,000 facilities, we are now down to 1,100 for more than 100,000 pregnancies terminated each year. And in some regions, it's a bit like in the US, really. It's like people need to travel more than 200 kilometers just to go to the mandatory counseling. Then they have to go home and wait for 72 hours. And later they need to make another one-day trip to access a clinic, which is even allowed to turn them down. So that's the situation. And the rally of the so-called pro-lifers is organized since 20 years already, and every time around the same date. And they want to make abortion rights even more restrictive. And it encompasses a wide range of organizations and institutions who are part of the German conservative and repressive state. And there are, for instance, this time there have been 3 Catholic bishops. There are the growing groups of evangelics. And one of those groups just took over a church in a strong migrant area in the north of Berlin. And this is a group linked to the far-right Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, a strong opponent of abortion rights, and of course, the right to choose as well. And there's a group which is called Durchblick, known for putting plastic baby embryos in post boxes of pro-abortion doctors and clinics. And they are linked to the Christian Democrats of the party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel. And they meet with party members from the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is also a right-wing party. And you know, a member of them is Beatrix vom Storch, whose grandfather was already a leading fascist under Hitler. And there's the so-called Volksstimme, the broadcast of the far-right fascist group, National Party of Germany, the NPD. And they were joined by right-wingers also from all over Europe, from Barcelona, for instance, and so on. And typically, they make about between 3,000 and 4,000 people. Unfortunately, this year as well, there were 3,000. So in our counter-protest, there are alliances from very radical to rather moderate feminist groups that organize a protest or even attempt to blockade the right-wingers demonstration. So, however, these protests are traditionally very small. There's a lack in strategy in really mobilizing openly, demanding strong support of trade unions, and take the mobilization on a larger stage. You know, organize buses from all over Germany and other places, also all over Europe, because we know it's not just, you know, they feel emboldened by what happened with Roe v. Wade. You know, like right-wingers are coming, you know, wherever they can come together. And so, yeah, Rosa and the ISA decided to do this year, you know, and we made a difference in size, in mobilization, in tactics, program, internationalism, and noise. And also thanks to you, Yaara, I think we made really, really great shouts. And yeah, and however, we need to give an idea of what is necessary to really stop and blockade those right-wingers. And we need, I think, next time, you know, really when we need to build up, we need actually a protest of at least 20,000 people or more to really effectively stop them. And I think we just had a start and saw a start of this, how it could look like this year. And therefore, we need to reach a bigger understanding in society why pro-lifers and their capitalist allies are dangerous to all of us and not just for possible childbearers.
Yeah, I think the demo was really inspiring for me, you know, like coming from somewhere else and seeing just how everywhere around the world that we go right now, this is something that's burning in people's like hearts. And they're willing to go out on the streets to say it. So obviously we intervene in this counter demo, and we had this really good block. But as you said, I was kind of chanting at the front of the demo, and I was wondering if you could, because we didn't really get a chance to speak after, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what people were saying, what kind of program we were putting forward, what kind of conversations we've had with people on the demo.
Yeah, so first of all, we made clear that the demo is an international, point of mobilization for the far right. So we need to give an international socialist feminist response. And we also connected it to a growing harassment of the LGBTQ community in Germany and the recent attacks on trans people and at the fringe of pride parades all over the country. One of those was also fatal. And so trans rights, women's rights, same struggle, same fight. That was one of our slogans that we were chanting, because the right-wing group that gathered together in Berlin on the 17th of September, they create a climate of hate and harassment against all non-traditional gender and family roles and ideas. And we also connected it to the reproduction and healthcare crisis. For instance, a Rosa activist who took part in a 6 weeks hospital strike in Berlin reported at a rally we organized in the evening after the demo about the lack in parental planning, health support, and wanted pregnancies, the lack of midwives and care workers, and the dangers this also has for people who want to become parents, but not to mention to those who decide against, who still, after a mandatory counseling and waiting for 72 hours, need to pay between 300 and 600 euros themselves for an abortion. And we also connected it to the energy and cost of living crisis, in which many people struggle to pay rent, energy costs, and food. There's a study that estimates that 60% of people who live in Germany will not be able to cover the growing cost by their monthly income. So to all this, neither the self-proclaimed pro-lifers nor the capitalist system as a whole, which is intrinsically violent and deathly for the working class, has an answer. They want us to procreate, and at the same time, they mobilize for new imperialist wars. And we see this right now in Russia. The government has there completely prohibited abortion under all circumstances to suppress the militant anti-war resistance of especially young women and queers, and push the order to produce more soldiers and workers as cannon fodder for profits. And we refuse this, and we need to fight for a socialist feminist mass movement to really fight back right-wing ideas and the capitalist basis on which they grow. And I think this is what we brought forward. And this was attractive to many people. I think we had people who came to the rally. We had people who discussed with us and who were really like inspired by the way we were bringing forward ideas, because we were saying, if we want to blockade, we really need to mobilize. We don't want to see how small blockades are beaten down by the police in front of these smiling and chanting so-called pro-lifers, anti-choicers. And so this time, we really have to discuss how we change it, but really link it to the social questions and capitalist questions we are struggling with right now.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it's all about, like you said, it's all about the choice to decide whether and when and how we want to have children or have a family, what kind of family we want to have, but also to make this choice out of really what we want and not out of necessity, whether it's because we can't have an abortion if we want to, or because we can't afford to have a child. So I think that was a really inspiring thing that I think was really clear that in the demo that people that resonated with people. And actually, if we're talking about kind of free abortion on demand and all of that, I think a focal point for the kind of abortion struggle internationally in the last few years has been Ireland, where there's been a huge victory for abortion rights that won a free abortion up to 12 weeks after a battle against an amendment to the Constitution that banned abortion completely. So I wanted to ask you, Ruth, because obviously you were incredibly not just involved in this struggle, but also one of the leaders of the struggle. So what kind of what kind of role did socialist feminism play in this victory?
Well, if you read the international press, you'd believe that the Leo Varadkar, for example, and the other so-called liberals won this, but that's far from the case. This was a relentless movement led by women, young people, working class women in particular, LGBT plus people. And it began around almost 10 years ago, actually now, with the tragic death of Savita, whose poster is here behind me. Savita's anniversary is actually coming up shortly, and I'll deal with that in a second. But right from the very beginning, the Socialist Party was involved in the debate that took place after Savita's death and what was the way forward. Unfortunately, there was a very conservative approach taken by the people who came to the leadership of that movement, and they opted to go for a very minimal change, leaving the constitutional ban in place, for example, that would have benefited very few people. And within a couple of years, it became evident to people that you had to be suicidal, go in front of a tribunal in order to get an abortion, and it simply wasn't working. And the impetus for the movement, particularly around 2014, we were fortuitous in some ways. We had set up Rosa, which is an anti-capitalist feminist group, because we saw an opening there. We were doing stalls on the streets. We were seeing the change that had taken place among working class people on the issue of abortion. And we saw the opening for an active pro-choice, anti-capitalist, socialist feminist organization. But then also in 2014, a by-election happened. And luckily, I won the seat. So we had, a woman in Parliament who was willing to make this an issue. We actually proposed, which probably a lot of people don't know, the very first repeal bill was moved by the Socialist Party in September 2014. We published it and moved the first stage in the Dáil. Needless to say, we didn't get the support to pass that bill, but we had put it on the agenda, and we made it clear from the moment we got elected that abortion is going to be a central issue that we push for. So within the Dáil and outside the Dáil, through direct actions and so on. In 2014, a very important event then happened whereby there had been a very famous feminist event here in Ireland called the Contraception Train. I don't know if any of you had heard of it. In 1971, when the first, the feminist wave was happening here in Ireland too at that time. And feminists decided to go up to the north of Ireland, where contraception was, legal, and import them and bring them back in full view. We decided to do the same with abortion pills. And we were breaking the law. We linked up with Women on Web, and it became a massive publicity around it, which helped to publicise the availability of safe medical abortion for women in Ireland and pregnant people, or anyone who is pregnant who couldn't get them. Just think, like most people in Ireland, you had to book into a clinic in the UK, you had to book flights, you had to give up work. It was a hugely costly thing for people to do. And the pills, made it a much more easier option. But when it came to the all-party committee discussing abortion, which I was a member of, we brought a clear pro-choice voice into that committee. We insisted on putting a pro-choice, not just repeal, but actually the type of law that you bring in is critical. And what was being talked about was a law for rape and fatal fetal abnormality, which would benefit very few people. And we, wanted to push the boundaries constantly to make sure that we got a law that dealt with the majority of reasons why people have abortions. And one of the ways, was some of the actions that we took with the abortion pills, because we made it so well known that should they bring in a really narrow law, we were going to come back and say, well, if that's what you do, fine, but women are going to continue clandestinely and publicly to do this, to have abortions in their bedrooms and so on. So I think the socialist feminist role that we played was making it a key that working class women in particular were catered for. And the law that was eventually brought in for 12 weeks on request, it's not perfect, and I'll deal with some, of the inadequacies of it later. But the TDs, the members of parliament, cited the abortion pills as a game changer, because in some ways it gave them a very easy way of, changing their opinion on abortion. The fact that these pills were being so widely used in Ireland. And also, only 1 in 10 GPs now are actually providing abortion services in Ireland. So this law, through conscientious objection, the Catholic Church has been able to, but it doesn't, well, it does matter, but still, because it's by prescription and generally by abortion pills, the service has been, accessible enough to cater for 6,000 people who would have had to travel otherwise. So I think, that through pushing as well for struggle, we said that the establishment in Ireland is inherently conservative. Like capitalism after independence 100 years ago had to rely on the Catholic Church for authority and support, and for suppressing women and the poor and working class people, as we know, through the mother and baby homes, the Magdalene laundries, and in myriad other ways, censorship, lack of any control over your own body, and that it would take a determined, relentless movement. And it did for 5.5 years after the death of Savita, before they actually granted us a referendum. And we always said if we got a referendum, we were confident we could win it. We had faith in ordinary people. It was the establishment who were lagging far behind. So I think there's some of the ways that we made it a huge issue.
Thanks so much, Ruth. I was going to ask you about that poster in the background, so I'm glad that you mentioned it. But you hinted at this law not being perfect, and when we're talking about fighting for reforms under capitalism, most of the time that's what happens, because it's a give and take, and the capitalists want to keep pushing back. And Kshama mentioned this a little bit too in regards to the US, but specifically in the case of Ireland, why is it important that, even after this historic victory that wasn't perfect, that the Socialist Party and Rosa remain mobilized and continue to struggle to win more?
Well, just to say, it is incredible that we have free abortion, and the fact that you don't even have to pay is incredible. And there's a few reasons for that. Actually, just quickly, one of the reasons is that because of when you're pregnant in Ireland, you're an actual handmaid, so you had to get free medical care. So then when they brought in abortion, if you go to a doctor to discuss abortion, it's free. The actual, so they had to provide free abortion. It was quite funny. But as well as that, there are 6,000 people who would have had to travel are having abortions in Ireland. So it is, seminal achievement. But it didn't go far enough. It didn't go as far as the Citizens' Assembly, which was set up, wanted it to go, because the politicians were too scared, too cowardly. So, for example, after 12 weeks, that's where the problems set in, because it's on request up to 12 weeks. So, for example, the amount of women who are accessing an abortion to save their life or for their health is pretty much the same as it's always been. And that tells you that when you criminalize abortion, it's a chilling effect on doctors. So actually, what happened to Savita technically could happen again, because a doctor has to decide and be convinced, because they have to answer questions. But the other reason is, for abnormalities, it's very, very strict. And so we still have people traveling for medical reasons. But it isn't just about abortion, and repeal wasn't just about abortion either. It was about the oppression of women in Ireland under this system for the last century. And it was about, the mother and baby homes. It was about, which are still a legacy issue now, by the way. It's a huge political issue right now in Ireland, because people didn't have rights to their own birth certs. Stories are coming out about babies being sold in the US illegally from these mother and baby homes. None of this has been dealt with. as well as that, we have the church still in control of our hospitals, our schools. We have the National Maternity Hospital, which is actually being handed over to a religious order, even though the public is paying for it. So we still have to fight for every single, element of progress. Like Kshama is right in what she said. You can have no faith in it, like in the US and the Democrats. We've no faith in the Conservative and the establishment parties in Ireland. There's unfinished business from repeal, but also obviously, on all the issues, a socialist feminist perspective is vital, because there is a huge interest in feminist ideas. I mean, I'm sure we'll be mentioning the fact that Iran is having a movement now. I mean, just says it all. And we want to to point out, like, how capitalism can't cater for and can't deliver equality for women. We've an increase in transphobia and LGBT phobia, just like, worldwide as well. So for all of those reasons, it's important to stay active and to go on and to, bring the edifice down.
I'm glad you mentioned, oh, there was an echo, sorry. I'm glad you mentioned Iran, Ruth, because, I've been seeing a lot of solidarity videos from women in Iran who are, cutting their hair and taking off their hijab. So, for people who maybe haven't seen what's going on there, can you just explain a little bit about the situation and what happened and, people who are uniting together to fight back?
Like, I think first of all, to salute the bravery of people is absolutely awe-inspiring. To see young people, to see women out on the streets now. And in some ways, it's a bit like our Savita moment in Ireland. Like, the death of Savita led to such outrage, such anger. It sparked and kindled a movement for abortion rights. Similarly, this young woman was refusing to wear a hijab and was essentially murdered by the regime. And it's just sparked, an outpouring. I don't know what's happening in each of the cities, but videos that I've seen women taking off their hijab, burning them. But it seems as well to be a movement of all genders, not just one, which I think is particularly important, because one thing that we would point to is that working class people hold the power in society, and we want to build a united movement, multi-generational, multi-gendered, multiracial, to challenge the system. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch. Rosa has called a protest in the next few days in Dublin, because we were contacted by women from Iran who live here. So we're going to be showing solidarity with the struggle there.
Yeah, it's so inspiring to see what's happening. And, I think that it's really easy to kind of dismiss that kind of like the impact that that kind of thing can have in a country like Iran. But it proves time and time again how women's rights are kind of pulling people out in the streets and fighting even the most dictatorial regimes. So it's so inspiring and interesting to see what's going to happen there. But I want to go back to kind of the main subject that we're talking about. And, Ruth was just talking about kind of the role that kind of from the ground of working class women and working class people had on kind of changing the abortion law in Ireland. And obviously, Ruth managed to take kind of the position that she had as a member of parliament and use it for the benefit of this struggle. And actually, fast forward to now, we have Kshama here, who has managed to do something very similar in the context of this horrible attack on women with the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and actually managed to make Seattle into a sanctuary city. So first of all, there's an amazing victory, and I think everyone who's watching it here can agree that it's incredible. And I wanted to ask you, Kshama, if you can tell us about kind of what was actually won and how it was won.
Yeah, as you said, Yaara, Ruth and the Irish Socialist Party, which is a sister organization of Socialist Alternative in the United States, used her position in the Irish Parliament to not only agitate around the question of abortion rights, but also concretely use it, using these kinds of demands that Ruth was talking about. Similarly, we have used our office in the same way, and the legislation that you mentioned, the abortion sanctuary city legislation, through that legislation, Seattle police will be prohibited from arresting people based on outstanding warrants related to anti-abortion laws in other states around the country. And the police will also be prevented from otherwise aiding in investigations of those cases. So people with abortion-related warrants, especially the healthcare providers who are often the targets of such arrests, will be able to live in Seattle without being extradited to whichever state is attempting to prosecute them. And as Ruth correctly described, we cannot stop at the reforms that we win. And so what we have won is not enough. And the question of building powerful enough mass movements nationwide to defeat this right-wing attack and to win full and fully funded abortion rights still remains. But this legislation is an extremely important victory. It shows what can be possible. And it would also, such legislation could also have even more profound impacts if it were to spread widely. Just imagine if hundreds of cities in half the states in the United States passed similar legislation, refusing to extradite people for breaking anti-abortion laws in the other half of the states. That could have a big impact. And starting later this month, in fact, we are going to be building on this victory and launching our annual People's Budget campaign in Seattle. And the flagship demand of this year's campaign is going to be to win full funding for abortion in Seattle for anybody who's here, not just people who have lived here for years, by increasing the Amazon tax, which is a tax on large corporations, basically billionaires and multimillionaires, of corporations like Amazon and Starbucks. This is a tax that we, led by Socialist Alternative and working people and union members in Seattle, we won in 2020 during the historic Black Lives Matter movement. And I should just share the broad support and excitement for our legislation, the abortion sanctuary legislation, is just quite evident. In more than 5,500 people signed our petition in support of the bill. And on the day of the vote on the city council, 60 people testified in public comment demanding that city council Democrats vote yes without watering the bill down. Most of the petition signatures were gathered by Socialist Alternative members during the Pride, LGBTQ Pride events in Seattle at the end of June, where we talked to thousands of working class people, LGBTQ people, and other people about the need for a unified mass movement to defeat the right-wing attacks. And we've got a lot of support for those ideas of a fighting strategy and tactics. And we tabled almost daily in the lead up to the victory on the legislation. And I just wanted to share, on the online version of our petition, hundreds of people left comments with personal stories. And I just wanted to quote one union healthcare worker who signed the petition, and she wrote, quote, "Our country is facing a crisis and we need to act now. If we don't increase funds and resources for abortions, we won't be prepared when overflow patients fleeing from Idaho and other red states come flooding in. Abortion clinics in Eastern Washington are already at capacity and things are only going to get worse. We need to prepare to meet this crisis immediately by raising the Amazon tax," end quote. So this shows that working people are not only ready to fight right now, they understand that, that's whatever we win today will take a fight and it won't be enough. We need to go even farther. And so that, I wanted to read that because it contrasts so deeply with the approach of the Democratic Party. The city council is me, one socialist, and 8 Democrats. And these Democrats, of course, they expressed words of outrage over the Supreme Court ruling, but at the same time, they were attempting to undermine our legislation in the back rooms, refusing to publicly reveal their intentions. Now, what they did was attempt to greatly weaken the clause that right now that we won, that mandates Seattle police not arrest people with the out-of-state warrants. And the only reason the Democrats backed off from their attempt to water it down was the spotlight put on them by the hundreds of people who have spoken up, who signed the petition, and who wrote to the Democrats saying, you should not water this down. It again proves the effectiveness of a working class mobilization, just like We heard about the example in Ireland and the protest that we were just part of in Germany. And Socialist Alternative has always warned working people that even when we force the Democrats to stand with us, that's because of working class momentum. And we cannot afford to draw the wrong conclusions that they're suddenly genuinely progressive. No, it's in fact, these are all progressive, supposedly progressive Democrats in name, but the two-facedness of their approach could hardly be evidenced more clearly than what happened in the back rooms, over this legislation. And during the same period, they also voted to end the meager $4 an hour pandemic hazard pay that our grocery workers had won in the city. So all of this shows that we need to keep fighting to win further reforms. We're going to have to fight to defend the reforms that we have won. And ultimately, none of that will be enough by itself. We have to tie the fight for reforms internationally by also raising the question of working class independence from the parties of big business, and also to the question of capitalism itself.
Thanks so much, Kshama. That's super exciting. I mean, the name sanctuary city is used a lot when it's talking about abortion rights, when it's talking about, the deportation of immigrants. But to actually be a sanctuary city is not just to, not get arrested or not get deported, but actually provide the services that are needed, that people are, running to get through taxing the rich, taxing Amazon. I really like that. That's awesome. So yeah, now, we'll kind of wrap up here with the three of you. This has been an excellent episode. But we've, used the term socialist feminism a lot here, especially when we're talking about Rosa International, which people should totally check out to see if there's a section of Rosa International where you live. But yeah, talking about why we need socialist feminism, right now. So Anne, I wanted to start with you. You talked about the demonstration that you went to in Berlin and, fighting back against these right-wing attacks. So what in your opinion is the reason that we need socialist feminism more now than ever?
Well, I think it's very important also to answer the cost of living crisis, and right-wingers are giving very, partial answers to this, and they give answers in a way of saying, it's the fault of whoever, or it's the fault of the immigrants, it's the fault of the whatever women or something, or the queers, or their really crazy ideas of the population change, and women don't want to procreate enough, and so on. And so this kind of split is so really toxic and dangerous to unite the working class. And socialist feminism is exactly doing the opposite. It's exactly what Yaara said. We are discussing the choice on each level. We want to have a choice and how to live, and how to have children, when to have children, and so on. And also, I mean, one of the major reasons in Munich why people seek to have an abortion is they don't have housing, So, when doctors were asking, why are you coming? And they said, well, I can't afford, to rent another place. There is no other place, So how this is not a choice, it's not a choice of having or not having. And I think the cost of living crisis is, the right wing, they also go on the street now for that. They say it's because of the war and so on, and of course there are aspects of that, but it's not the fault of the ordinary people, working class people from Russia or Ukraine or whatever, or it's also not the fault of women that this is happening, but we know that the violence will also increase. We have seen this with the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009, that when economic crises are rising, we see this also, that this is, hitting or pushing down on in family and patriarchal family structures as well. So we know that we need a feminist and socialist response to unite the working class on all levels, and fight these splits and attempted oppressions that the right wing is doing, because the right wing is an ally to the ruling class at the end of the day. It's an ally to capitalism and to a stronger and more authoritarian version of capitalism and more undemocratic version of capitalism. And feminism is a democratic answer, as democratic as it can be.
I think that's a really good point about the right and kind of how it's empowered and emboldened as well in the recent time. But also, like we talked about throughout this episode, how even though the right is emboldened, the fight back is emboldened as well. So like using socialist feminism as kind of a tool to kind of defeat the far right on every element, and not just on women and queer rights, but also on that is super important. And I was wondering, from what you said, like I want to ask Kshama if you can explain what we mean by socialist feminism, like what is different and why is it so necessary to have the socialist part in socialist feminism?
Yeah, to explain what socialist feminism is, I think we should also, just start with what kind of feminism has been on offer so far, for the most part, for the millions and indeed tens of millions of women and LGBTQ people and young people as a whole of all genders who are looking for a way to change society. The Dobbs decision in the US, in the attacks on abortion rights that have happened worldwide, all of this represents a massive failure of what I would call liberal feminism, which is the brand of feminism defined by diversifying the ruling class in a superficial manner. These are the ideas that have led to the debacle that we're in, which I was talking about earlier, the failure of the mass or women's rights organization to put up any kind of fight back because of how tied they are to the interests of the ruling class. These ideas can also be described and have been described by others as, so-called girl boss feminism. And the term girl boss feminism, sort of really exemplifies how this kind of feminism, liberal feminism, can never bring about true equality for women. What it does is guarantees the rights of some women to oppress others, and for the most part, the vast majority of humanity gains little to nothing. And at the same time, what we are seeing, and from everything that everybody has said right now, the stage looks to be set for a new feminist movement to come onto the scene. The question is, what kind of women, what kind of movement we need, and why is the stage set? Because it shows, we're seeing that the youth of today are ready to fight back against gender-based violence. There's been a wave of high school and student protests, for example, throughout the world. But it will take bigger victories. And we saw recently in the state of Kansas in the United States, for example, where after the Dobbs ruling debacle, there was a landslide victory with record voter turnout of ordinary people rejecting a ballot measure in big numbers, rejecting a ballot measure that would have removed abortion rights from the state constitution. So all of this shows that there is an openness for a real movement for feminism. But what should that look like? For one, we need to not only reverse the right-wing attack on abortion rights, but we need to go farther and win a broader program of demands. And what are those demands? That's something we need to talk about. And also, as all the speakers were indicating, the forces of the right are international. So we also need a movement of an international movement of working class women, LGBTQ, and working people of all genders to come together. We need rank and file union members to help lead the movement. And I think this is the most paramount point that we need to draw out, which is that this movement has to be tied to rejecting the system of capitalism itself, this global system that has shown that it is not only incapable of protecting the rights that working people ourselves have won through our own fight back, but that it is carrying out continual and further attacks on working people. Women's exploitation continues under capitalism, not to mention the climate crisis, inflation, recession. So what we need is a socialist society globally where the wealth and resources of the world are democratically controlled by working people so that they can be harnessed for the good of humanity as a whole, for the rights of working people internationally. So to come anywhere close to attaining any of this, we need the right kind of movement, strategy, and tactics, and that is what we would call a socialist feminist movement, a movement that fights for a program of demands, as I was saying earlier, that is focused on the needs of the working class. So for example, here we're talking about the needs of working class women and pregnant people and the LGBTQ community. That should mean free abortion as a part of, in the United States context, a part of a Medicare for all type system that also provides gender affirming healthcare, as well as paid parental leave, affordable or free childcare, affordable housing, by expanding social, democratically owned, publicly owned social housing programs. And it also means, as Anne said, a real fight back against the cost of living crisis, and also, helping working people push back against the burden of the coming recession being placed on their shoulders. And in contrast to the failed liberal feminist strategy of backing corporate Democrats in the United States, a socialist feminist movement would take up working class methods of struggle, street protests, walkouts, direct action and strikes, as well as an electoral strategy that is independent of the Democratic Party establishment, which means working class people building their own political organization. And last but not least, as I said before, unlike liberal feminism, which has no real objection to capitalist exploitation and oppression, and in fact, unfortunately, goes part and parcel of it, it is really what's really needed is the transformative vision of a socialist society that is democratically run by working people, that is integral to any idea of socialist feminism, because it is only on this basis that sexism and other forms of oppression will become relics of the past. And I just wanted to urge in closing that if people who are listening to this, if you're in the United States, definitely contact Socialist Alternative if the ideas discussed in this show have been appealing to you.
Yeah, I think it's so kind of interesting to me to see kind of how the feminist movement has progressed, because what you're talking about, like kind of girl boss feminism, like breaking the glass ceiling, all of these ideas were really prevalent and kind of like the biggest things that people were talking about when I entered the feminist movement years ago. But now it seems like that is no longer, and rightly so, no longer what people care about. People can see and are acutely aware that all kinds of oppression and all kinds of exploitation that we experience in our everyday life are connected, and they're all connected to the system, the systemic. They're not just, randomly happening. So I think that, a lot of people are drawing these conclusions, like you said, and it's so important that it goes beyond just seeing the issue, but also presenting with a real solution, like you said, which can only be socialism and can only be socialist feminism. So to finish off, I wanted to ask you, Ruth, so if people watch it and had all the questions answered by this episode and by the ideas of socialist feminism, how can you actually be a socialist feminist? What do you need to do, and how can we actually fight these very practical and tangible things like abortion and reproductive rights?
Well, the best people that win in reforms are revolutionaries. I mean, that's always been the case. Like, you look back at James Connolly here in Ireland, who set up the trade union movement, Jim Larkin as well. And actually, I have to get a plug in for we're having a march to mark the 10th anniversary of the death of Savita, but to push forward on the other issues of separation of church and state, and so on. Capitalism as a system, it has inequality in its DNA. I mean, it's built on justifying inequality. And, something like 22 men control the same wealth as 3.5 billion people, according to Oxfam, a Christian charity. So how can a system like that deliver equality? We're actually going through the third systemic crisis in about 14 years. We had in 2008 the financial crash, the bank bailouts. We had then, the COVID pandemic, and now we have the cost of living crisis, which is going to, there is a class war around that. Who's going to pay for that crisis? Is it going to be working class people, or is it going to be the wealthy in society? And, so I would appeal to anybody, if you're looking at that as a system, become a socialist feminist. And it isn't just the economic issues either, it's the issues of oppression, because as a system, capitalism needs rigid gender roles. It pushes rigid gender roles. I mean, look at the way now, for example, it can't even concede on the basic rights for transgender people. It's just like a bridge too far for the system. It pushes sexism, racism, misogyny, and division. We saw also during the COVID pandemic, a pandemic of gender-based violence. What a system that's what it offers women LGBT plus people. And I think it rests on obviously things like unequal pay, which rest also on discrimination on the basis of race and on the basis of sex, but also it relies on the unpaid work that women do in society. That's why it pushes rigid gender roles, and which we all know is enormous, and it increased enormously during the pandemic in particular. So I think that if anybody who's listening wants to fight, to change the system, I don't think that there's many young people that have much faith in this corporate feminism that you mentioned, Yaara, anymore. I mean, definitely that's what I find. But there isn't clarity about the type of feminism that is needed. And I think that we need a debate, and we need to inject socialist feminism into that debate and win the best young people, the best women and LGBT plus people to socialist banner.
The struggle for abortion rights is more important than ever. Everywhere right-wing capitalist governments are attacking women's rights. China is no exception. The so-called communist dictatorship defends a brutal capitalist and patriarchal system. 1 in 5 women in the world live in China. The dictatorship controls women's bodies, controls their uterus, in ways that are hard to imagine in other countries. For more than 40 years, the dictatorship has controlled how many children a woman can have. It used to be a strict one-child limit, but in 2016 it was increased to 2 children and now 3 children. This control has been enforced brutally in many cases. Forced abortions and even sterilization is part of this control over women's bodies. For oppressed minority women like Uyghurs, this is happening now. In China, a single woman is not allowed to have a child unless she is married to a man. The child will be illegal and refuse the legal documents. This means the child can't go to school, get medical attention, or get a job. Today, China faces a population crisis. Next year, the UN says India will take over China as the world's most populous nation. The birth rate in China has collapsed because people can't afford to have children. The economic crisis today means the birth rate will fall even more. Chinese people face severe wage cuts and mass unemployment. Women are discriminated at work if they become pregnant. Patriarchal and sexist attitudes are endemic in China. These ideas are reinforced by the dictatorship as a tool of social control, of men controlling women. Women are expected to look after children, but also elderly relatives. Most child care in China is privatized and very expensive. Now the government is changing its controls on women's reproductivity. Instead of banning children, it wants women to have more babies. Last year, the government announced new restrictions on the right to abortion. It says that medically unnecessary abortions will be limited. Access to contraception is also under attack in China. In some cities, volunteer organizations that conduct sex education for young people and distribute contraceptive have been evicted. Previously, abortion was widely available in China. For the dictatorship, this was not about reproductive rights. It was a tool of state policy, the one-child policy, to control women's bodies. During these 40 years, more female uterus were aborted than male. Now there are 35 million more men than women in China. This has made also the population crisis more acute. Now the dictatorship is reducing access to abortion as a further measure of state control over reproductive rights. Women in China are being radicalized and are fighting back against this oppression. The dictatorship is afraid of the growth of feminist ideas. We socialist feminists linked the struggle for women's equality to the struggle against capitalism and the dictatorship. These struggles cannot win unless they are linked. A united struggle for socialism and sexual liberation will be unstoppable.
Thank you so much. This has been such a great episode. 3 guests from around the world talking about, fighting for socialist feminism, fighting for reproductive justice. This has been a really good one. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. But don't log off yet, because of course we have the shout out of the week.
Yes, so the shout out of the week this week is actually about the elections in Sweden, which I'm sure everyone's heard about. It was a really tough election because of the like we talked about now, about how the far right is emboldened, and in Sweden I think it's even clearer the way that it's done, and the far right actually gained quite a lot in this election using this kind of populist rhetoric that we're used to from the far right. But actually, members of the International Socialist Alternative in Sweden ran for this election and managed to protect their seats in Luleå. And even though we didn't manage to do that in Stockholm, it was still a really incredible campaign under really difficult circumstances with the far right. So it's a really important victory for us in Luleå and in Sweden generally. And also, I think there was great to kind of put forward our ideas in both places and around the country as well, and kind of show that when the correct ideas are being put forward, people are going to agree with them, even under the immense pressures from the far right. So this has been our shout out of the week today, and obviously a really important episode for the International Day for Safe Abortion. So hopefully you've learned from it like I did. I thought this was brilliant to hear from so many people with such great experience on abortion struggle generally. And we'll see you soon.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!